Thank you. So yeah, we've been talking about values and change in urban Ballarat. Hopefully that becomes clear as I talk why we're talking about this particular this particular town in Australia. Um, I just want to start. It's custom in Australia to acknowledge the country uh, on which we are. This is a map of Australia. It might be a bit different to a number of the maps of Australia that you may have seen before, but it's a map of a language map of Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures and Indigenous languages and nations prior to colonisation in the 18th and 19th century, and also continuing. These are in many cases live languages. So I'm proud to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Wadawurrung country in the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge the Wadawurrung people on whose country I live and work. We here in Ballarat pay respects to all elders, past and present, as well as elders from other communities who are also in our region today. They hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around Australia. And so just a bit of a context around where I am now. Australia, as you can see, is a very large place. And you can see in the bottom corner there, that yellow circle, that's where I am on Wadawurrung country. I'm in Ballarat, which is actually a Wadawurrung word. It's actually two Wadawurrung words. It means, it's two words, Ballarat, Ballarat, and that means place of the elbow. And it was named that way because it was called a place of rest, because people would lie down on their elbow, relaxing. And so it was known as the place of rest, Ballarat. And that's the sort of reference that I've made earlier before, I suppose, and in thinking about this topic, that actually since colonisation in Australia, which I'll talk a little bit about, we've actually been in a state of unrest. And partly what Hull, or the historic urban landscape approach to heritage, enables us to do is to recognise that unrest and actually to confront some of it does many things, but one thing I think it does is help us to confront some of the more difficult aspects of our heritage in ways. And I hope that becomes clear as we talk. So today's session, we have quite some time, so thank you. I rarely get the opportunity to talk for this long, and with so many people. I'm really impressed that you've all turned up on a Saturday. We will talk a little bit about Australia and Ballarat, a short history, very short, I promise. But I'm sure you were wondering a little bit, why are we talking about this place? Then I'll talk a bit about the historic urban landscape approach. And I'm not sure how much you have already studied or how much you are aware of the historic urban landscape approach. So I haven't gone into, in what I've prepared, I haven't gone into a great deal of detail in terms of how it came about and what it means and its status in UNESCO and so on. But we can talk about that if you like. But what I thought I would talk about is what I'm calling theoretical adaptations, kind of in the implementation of Hull, or historic urban landscape. What are some of the theoretical positions that we've been sort of coming across and thinking about? Not for too long, because I think we're probably more interested in how it's actually happened locally and some examples. So those examples will be the Ballarat East Local Area Plan, excuse me, and the Ballarat Orphanage, which is a topic an area I've been particularly involved with, and it's been a good opportunity to kind of think about those histories. So a little bit about me and who I am. Thank you for the introduction, but yeah, Dr. David McGinniss is my name. I have a Ph.D. from Federation University. I work at Federation University. Federation is a small university in the city of Ballarat, but also in locations all over Australia. It is a focus on regional meaning not urban. I'm sure there are very different contexts in Australia and Thailand and other parts of Asia in terms of what we mean by regional. But we kind of pride ourselves on being a regional university, and we're very much about sort of enabling people to access education. My discipline is probably a bit different to most of yours. I'm maybe not, but I'm a historian. So particularly looking at the history of government, this history of social welfare and the relationships with communities within. And so that's my background, and that's why I'll probably be talking from a bit of a historical point of view, but how the Hull approach enables those approaches to be approached in the modern time. So I'll just plough ahead. I'm occasionally stopping for questions, but I think it was pointed out we might have questions afterwards. So I'll just sort of pause every now and then if there's anything. I can't see comments or anything like that. So if there's anything, please do feel free to interrupt me if we want to stop at any point. So this is a really, really short overview of a very, very long history. Australian history is often regarded as Australia is often regarded to be a very young country. But nothing could be further from the truth. It's in terms of how we understand countries and nations now, yes, it was established in 1788, and yeah, in that colonial period. There's actually at least 50,000 years of continuous cultural attachment and social and economic organisation that has happened in Australia over the previous at least 50,000 years and possibly more. So just on that timeline, I've kind of tried to emphasise that, to see how sort of recent a lot of the developments are here in Australia. And actually we do have the opportunity and responsibility to tap into a lot of those longer histories. And that is certainly within history and within heritage here in Australia. There's a very strong movement at the moment, and is really part of the shift that I think has enabled historic urban landscape approaches to find fertile ground, is because we have started to think about our heritage as a nation very differently over the past 20 years with the rise of awareness and activism and education around pre-colonial Australian cultures. I won't go, there's a lot to cover there, so I won't go into that in more detail, except to point it out. But the more familiar story that you may have heard in 1788, around Sydney, what's now Sydney, a British penal colony was established, which means that convicts, prisoners, were sent from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, other parts of the British Isles, and sent to Australia as prisoners. And then the society or the community was established from there. Again, there's a lot we could talk about, but that's not what we're here. But just as a context, and it was very British colonial military state for that period of time, from the 1780s to the 1850s. From the 1850s, I think the major change that happened with the gold rushes, and that was just a major demographic boom that happened in Australia. And actually, on a global scale, it's one of the largest migrations that has happened, certainly in the 19th century. And it transforms what Australia is and how it is understood and how people live here. So Ballarat, the city that I'm in right now, was where that gold rush started. And within 10 years, it had gone from a small Wadawurrung Aboriginal settlement or nomadic settlement into a city of 40,000 plus people within about 10 or 15 years. And I think that context of major growth, that may not seem in other Asian contexts, that may not be so large, but at the time, and given the context, we actually have been through periods of urban growth, massive urban growth before, and it's the gold rushes that did that. From 1901 was what was known as Federation, which was kind of a limited independence from Britain. So we still have the British Queen is still our head of state, although she has no effective role in our government. But you can see there the British flag is still part of our flag, and we're still struggling to overcome some of those colonial identities. And I think that's relevant to the ways in which we've understood heritage in the past. Again, I won't go into it in great detail, but just as a context. From the 1940s onwards, we have the World War and then the Cold War, which sort of recalibrates Australian sort of cultural identity to still include Britain, but certainly towards the United States. And the very well documented histories of the Cold War form a very influential part of our kind of cultural development in Australia. And then into the 21st century, obviously this is a very brief overview, but it has been described in Australia, not universally, but it's been described in Australia as the Asian century, where culturally, socially, economically, politically, there's been a belated or a too late recognition that actually geographically we're part of the Asian region. Now that may not be a view shared across Asia, but there is certainly a shift in Australian cultural and social life towards understanding that we're part of the Asian century. The pandemic has probably set that back some way, and many other political developments have set that back some way. But I think that's the trajectory that we're on. And the symbol I kind of chose there was that's everyone knows what that emblem is, but that's the Asian Football Confederation emblem, which is a symbol. I think that Australia has actually joined the Asian Football Confederation and competes in the Asian Cup. And so kind of culturally, just an example of the ways in which that's happened. I'm being a bit flippant there. But anyway, that's a really brief overview that I hope sets a bit of context to how we are kind of approaching heritage in Australia. So Ballarat, it's in Victoria, Australia. So that map of Australia that you can see up in the corner here, that's maybe the version of Australia, the map of Australia you may have seen before. And these are the states of Australia. There are 7 of them, or 6 of them plus territories. And we're here in this corner in Victoria, what's known as Victoria, named after Queen Victoria. Remember, I was talking about the ongoing influence of British culture and authority, named after Queen Victoria, and we're kind of here. Some of you may have been to Australia before and gone to Melbourne, which is the 2nd largest city in Australia. Melbourne is just here. So just to give you a bit of context. So Ballarat, it's not a large place. It's a population of 110,000, more or less, a bit more than that. As I mentioned, it's the traditional country of the Wadawurrung people, but also parts of Ballarat's territory is also the traditional country of the Djadjurrung people. There have been different phases of urban and colonial development here. Look, I won't go into huge detail because I've just gone through the Australian version of it, but from the 1830s, there was small-scale kind of pastoral settlement, which means, maybe 1 or 2 families over a period of over a range of 100 kilometres or so, tending to sheep and so on. That was the first interaction that happened. We are inland, so a lot of the invasion that occurred in the colonial period didn't make it inland until later. I pointed out before the gold rush and the significant impact that had. No greater was it felt here in Ballarat than here in Ballarat. where we had a gold rush and just massive urban, industrial and civic growth that I sort of described a little bit before, but you can see here, I hope you can see my pointer, but over on the right-hand side, you've got this examples of this sort of Victorian, British, hybrid Australian architecture that is all over Ballarat. We're quite famous for this kind of intact and distinctive sort of Victorian architecture, as it's known. But also urban industrial growth as well. So you can see here, this is actually where gold was first found, and it is now a sort of channel that is kind of directing water in ways that this go. It's a very beautiful town, but it's also a functioning town. It's always, I think it should be understood in its industrial context as well as its sort of civic. And the gold rush kind of finished, not finished, but, diminished. There was a period of economic decline. Post-World War II, there was a shift to manufacturing, and so Ballarat became known as a very productive city, working class, and quite down to earth. But it also kind of had this sort of gold rush nostalgia. And again, if any of you have been here, there is almost like an obsession with this kind of gold rush past and this kind of architectural grandeur and display of wealth, and almost like that wealth has gone, but we have this very nostalgic view of the gold rush. And then now into the 21st century, with the urban metropolitan proximity, as we're kind of saying here, it's very close to Melbourne, which is home to 5 million people. It's really, how does it maintain kind of a separate identity with the sort of the urban sprawl that is one day or is starting to kind of encroach from this major metropolitan centre. Again, probably compared to Bangkok and many other cities in Asia, you'd be well aware of those kind of metropolitan sort of mega cities. Melbourne is kind of been growing that way. It is an enormous city, 5 million, but it is in size. It is enormous. And so there's been a bit of what's the relationship between these regional centres like Ballarat and Melbourne with these distinctive identities. That has been curtailed or slowed down a bit in the pandemic, and there is actually now been a real shift from people moving to places from like Ballarat because it is smaller, because it is a bit easier. Life is easier. Melbourne, you may have heard, was subject to very extensive lockdowns over the pandemic period, in which, as I'm sure in many of the places you are today, were as well. But I think Melbourne has been known as the most locked down city in the world during the pandemic. And it's a period in which people were had a lot of time inside to contemplate their lives and what their values were. And what we're finding here in Ballarat is that they're actually moving to these smaller places. It's almost like another population boom. So that's sort of the context in which we're happening here. So, but probably the reason why we're talking about Ballarat is because what I've just described is probably not different to many other cities around Australia and the world. But we've been here testing and developing and implementing this historic urban landscape approach since 2012. What is it now? It's nearly 10 years, my goodness. So yeah, I think that's where the interest probably lies. So the historic urban landscape approach. So again, I'm not sure how much detail you've all gone into before. So yeah, so in 2011, UNESCO issued a recommendation regarding the historic urban landscape approach. to urban conservation. And it was part of like a lengthy ongoing discussions over many years. That was about shifting this gradual shift away from treating the city or the historic city as a visual object to an interest in the environment as a space, the city as a space for ritual and experience rather than as a place to be viewed and observed. So the UNESCO recommendation on the historic urban landscape, it's a non-binding declaration that provides, I believe, what it does is it provides motivation for heritage practitioners and urban developers worldwide to provide some motivation to shift their thinking around heritage, but it doesn't tell them how to do it necessarily. That's sort of been the job of a number of cities around the world. It's an approach to heritage management and urban conservation, but it's not a heritage category in itself. So I think that's an important point, and it's kind of comes to how we sort of understand heritage in our systems, I suppose. But it's intended to apply to all urban heritage. So it's not a world heritage or a national heritage. It's not a level of protection, it's an approach. And that's something that hasn't been understood, and at least initially here in Ballarat. Things continue to change, even though we're kind of held up as a UNESCO city of historic urban landscapes. A lot of people have interpreted that to mean, oh, we're not going to change. We're going to be a historic city. It's actually kind of the opposite, where it's actually saying we are going to change and we need to be able to be handling that change in better ways. So the main text, like the sort of the foundation text, is Francesco Bandara and Ron Van Oors. I think it's called The Historic Urban Landscape, around 2010 or 11 or so. But that's where they're pointing out that there's no city in the world that has retained its original character, and that hasn't been changed over time, and that the physical fabric of each city adapts constantly to the changing use of place. So change is inevitable. Social change, economic change, environmental change, natural, human-made, through disaster, or combination of all those things. So the historic urban landscape, like I said, aims to manage change, not stop it. So there's a number, you can see here, there's a number of sort of categories that the historic urban landscape kind of describes. So the urban area is understood as a result of historic layering of cultural and natural values. So I just think those are really important points, that there's no time at which one value or one landscape replaces and subsumes the other. They're always kind of laid on top of each other. And that's the same goes for values. There's no point at which things suddenly change, but we've got to understand that as a layering. And there's a list here, and there's sort of a lot of research, I suppose, done in each of those areas: topography, geomorphology, natural features, the built environment, open spaces, social and cultural practices and values, economic processes, and intangible heritage. And I guess I just highlight this because this is, I guess, what I'm focusing on, is the social and cultural values and social and cultural practices. And this is just something, this is from the actual recommendation, but, you know, processes of demographic shifts, global market liberalisation, decentralisation, mass tourism, market exploitation of heritage, and climate change, critical. Conditions have changed and cities are subject to development pressures and challenges not present at the time of the adoption of the UNESCO recommendation in 1976. So it's saying it's not that what we've got now doesn't fit. And, you know, like every city around the world, Ballarat is one such city that's subject to those forces. So I'll put, this is what I think though. This is what I think it boils down to. This is sort of my opinion, I suppose, based on, but that it's that heritage is about values and use more than it is about buildings. Often buildings are the most easily understood expression of values, and so we have systems in place to protect and preserve them. But because we've tried so hard and had to fight so hard to have those protections in place, I believe in Australia, we've kind of forgotten that it's not actually the buildings that we're trying to protect, it's what they express. They only matter because they express social and cultural values. So like we said, those values layer over time, both metaphorically in our collective identities, but literally in our landscapes. And so the historic urban landscape, I suppose, helps us to address this question. How do we understand whether, how, and why those values have changed, and whose values do we value most? And I think that's in that context of change. So that's my belief. And yeah, I hope to demonstrate that somehow. Okay. Some theoretical, what have I called it? Adaptations. So Francesco Bandaran and Ron Van Oors have written extensively. Ron is no longer with us, very sadly. And many others have taken up the theoretical sort of approach, and there's any number of readings that we could give you to talk about that. I feel this is sort of a way in which theoretically it's kind of going in Ballarat. Again, my sort of take on it, but yeah. So Graham Davison is an Australian historian, and I just find this kind of idea really valuable. What we value in the past lies not in its analytical precision, but in its resonance, as in how it's felt. And I believe that in heritage, the conventional or traditional ways of approaching heritage, we've tried to articulate that resonance through precision, defining and protecting. Hang on. So here are a couple of theoretical constructs that might help us overcome that. So landscape theory. It's a historical concept, so and many others. I suppose it's an artistic concept as well. But it enables a place-bound focus rather than a time-based or temporal focus. Recognizing all those change that we're subject to change over all those times. So there's artifacts of 1,000 previous moments that are interweaved with each other, and it creates that unique present written into a landscape. So it's almost seeing a landscape like a text. Ken Taylor and Jane Lennon, two Australian theorists who claim landscapes as cultural constructs, in which we're continuously making places by changing the landscapes through inhabiting it. And the products of those landscapes, the buildings, the structures, the patterns of land use, need to be viewed and understood within that cultural context. Alan R.H. Baker, I think he's English, I think he lived some time ago, and also is looking at that. We're looking at material structures within their kind of social constructedness. So they're created and destroyed within ideological contexts. And so while the study, yeah, I think I've sort of said, yeah, that landscapes are created and destroyed by mental attitudes, both individual and collective. And yeah, DW Mining, life must be lived amidst that which was made before. Every landscape is an accumulation and the past endures. And I guess it's kind of saying that the past endures through the activities and through the experience of it, not necessarily only through the built form. There's a lot we could talk about there, but I don't want to get too theoretical. And the other sort of theoretical influence is phenomenology. And again, I'm not sure how much you've come across this before, but it's certainly quite a popular theoretical sort of position in Australia at the moment. That is it's about embodying ourselves within, in this case, landscape and its history. So Yi Fei Tuan talks about how place at all scales, from the armchair, from where you're sitting to the nation, is a construct of experience. And phenomenological approaches to place are based on description of experience of landscape that create and strengthen value in the landscape. It's the study of whatever appears to the consciousness, so it's a descriptive philosophical discipline. Others, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre, sort of European, continental, French and German sort of philosophers who kind of been part of this phenomenological tradition. But yeah, it's sort of the negation of other previously dominant philosophical approaches, such as, Descartes. I'm not a philosopher, so apologies if any of you are and know more about this than me, but from what I understand it, René Descartes is a French philosopher, very, very influential in Western society, which was about sort of the objectivity of humans, and that, that we exist because of our ability to analyze and objectify things and be separate from them. Phenomenology is almost the rejection of that, the opposite, is that actually we exist because we are within objects, not because we're separate to them. There's all sorts of other things we could talk about, but I think we'd probably rather get into some more current examples. I think, so just something that kind of landscape and phenomenology. Really interested in exploring these as theoretical positions. But back to Ballarat. So this is here's a whole range of more pictures of Ballarat to kind of bring us back back here. So you can see that there is a like I described before, the sort of architectural significance. There's sort of this is the Botanic Gardens, place of gathering, place of wouldn't say natural beauty, but sort of planted beauty, where there's a lot of transplanted trees from Europe mainly to create almost like a European garden sort of environment. Next to that is a place called Lake Wendouree. I was going to do a case study on that, but if we get time, I might talk about it. But Lake Wendouree is a pretty fascinating place in that it's where everybody in Ballarat goes to recreate, to exercise. But the word Wendouree is a Wadawurrung word that actually means, or at least the story goes, Wendouree means go away. And so when people arrived, the first colonists arrived in Ballarat, they said, "What do you call that place?" And they said Wendouree, and they thought, "What a beautiful name." But actually, we were being told to get out of here, and I think that is a sort of a colonial sort of tension that we've never resolved. And anyway, if we get time, we'll talk about that. But maybe later. But this here, so this is a Wadawurrung ceremony, a smoking ceremony on the streets of Ballarat. It's very common ritualistic expression of Wadawurrung culture and many Aboriginal national cultures. And this is actually from Indian Independence Day, and this is a man making a speech in recognition of Indian Independence Day in January under a didn't quite get it on there, but under the statue of Queen Victoria. So you can see all these different sort of global, colonial, local traditions all coming together in this one place. And again, of course, the industrial traditions and manufacturing that I talked about in this kind of expression of industrial heritage. So Hull, the historic urban landscape in Ballarat, why and how? It's a good question, and it's one that we get asked a bit when we're talking about this. One thing I should probably make clear, though, is that so the Hull in Ballarat, it's run and managed. It's an initiative of the local government here in Ballarat. I won't go, give a lesson on the different levels of government and so on in Australia, but we have local government, state government, national government, and the Historic Urban Landscape is an initiative of Ballarat, the city of Ballarat. And so it's being run at a very local level. I don't represent the city of Ballarat. I'm from Federation University, so anything I say is not, the official word on this, but we do work very closely together. So in Ballarat, we've long been recognised for heritage here, inverted heritage. And the classic line about Ballarat is old gold and cold. We're old, although, our colonial heritage really only goes back 150 years or so, but we're considered old. Gold, we talk about gold a lot and the discovery of gold and the sale of gold and so on. And we're very cold. We're actually, if any of you have been here to Ballarat, you'll know this. It's freezing cold here, which visitors from overseas are often very surprised by. They think that here in Australia it's hot everywhere. But that's become this kind of unofficial identity of the place, old, gold and cold. And I was talking before about sort of the nostalgia for the gold rush. But I think, as I pointed out before, the population is growing and the demographics are changing. And heritage has been seen by some. Again, this is where I'm not representing the official line here of the local government, but heritage was seen by some as a barrier to change, and that people were moving here as part of that sort of metropolitan urban sprawl of Melbourne, and wanting to develop it and to demolish some of the older buildings and build it up as a city like any other. And heritage, because it's so strong here and because there is quite a sort of a strong community feeling about it, was seen as a barrier. And it was almost like you can't get anything done. The sense was you can't get anything done in Ballarat because they're all so obsessed with the past, old, gold and cold. Now that's not a sustainable way of approaching the future. It's not a good way of approaching the future. But we knew here that heritage is important, and that heritage was aligned with beauty and a sort of a sense of place. And this is where we're getting into the hull and how it sort of operates. So I'll come back to that one, sorry. Hull in action. So there we go. That's Ballarat, sort of an aerial view. Part of it, at least. So the first thing that happened, how the hull came about here is that, the local government was recognising, the university sort of recognising some of those challenges and reading broadly and hearing about things, and came across Ron Van Ors and the Historic Urban Landscape movement and just invited him to come because they were talking about, and it was talking about things that seemed to resonate with what we were worried about. And then we were signed up as a city, as a trial city. It's almost as simple as that. So in terms of thinking about what is a hull city and what does it take, it just takes sort of curiosity. So that's my advice if any of you are thinking about how to sort of, if you're attracted by any of these kind of concepts and ideas, how to progress it. Talk to WITRAP, the World Heritage Institute of Teaching Research in the Asia Pacific. I think it's in Shanghai. I think we've got the contact details there, or get in touch with me, or get in touch with Sue Fayad. I'll give you all those details. But it really was, there was no selection process. It's really just who's interested. This was a little while ago anyway. But so we signed up, and then it was like, well, now what? What does that mean? We understand the challenges, but how are we going to do anything about it? So we kind of broke it down into these three things. And so I said before, we know that people in Ballarat placed a lot of value on heritage. And that's because we asked these three questions. What do you love about Ballarat? What do you imagine Ballarat's future? And what do you want to keep about it? And this has been known as Ballarat Imagine. And it's actually become sort of a foundational framework for sort of historic urban landscape approaches. We've got 6,000 responses, which is, in a population of around 100,000, it's about 6% of the population. It's not bad. And I'm not going to analyze these for you, but just to kind of show that this is very simple analysis, but this is where, we're just kind of starting to track it and understand the different priorities or, desires or whatever it might be, values of people in Ballarat. But we can see here that heritage, not broadly defined, but is very highly valued. It's what people love. People imagine. You can see here, though, like heritage in terms of the future. People weren't really imagining sort of heritage as part of their future, but it was something that I wanted to keep, something I wanted to retain. So there's a bit of a challenge there around heritage is seen as this inhibitor to achieving that kind of change. There's a lot more to this, so there's just kind of pointing out that we've actually got data around what people value, and we're able to kind of use that to influence decision making. And so I should have had this slide a bit later on, and so this is kind of where the 6 critical whole steps kind of came in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not going to go through the 6 steps one by one, but there is a lot of material support. I'll give you the links to them, and you can explore that. But really, it's about this is kind of laid out by Van Daren and Van Oors and adapted here, but comprehensive surveys and mapping of natural, cultural, and human resources. I'll show you some of that later if you want. Reach consensus on values through participatory planning. Now, I always thought that was almost an impossible task to reach consensus, but you can if you bring people along. And so we've had a few examples of that, of how you can sort of do that sort of participatory planning kind of exercise. Assessing vulnerability to socioeconomic and climate change stresses. So, yeah, if you've got sort of planning processes in place, then these are critical sort of filters that you need to apply over the top of it. Integrate the values, and so these elements, integrate them into a wider city development framework. So in Ballarat, we've had the Ballarat strategy, which I'll show you a bit later. And then prioritising actions, and there's hundreds of them, but you can kind of prioritise them because you've done this sort of process. And then establishing the partnerships and local management frameworks to coordinate activities. So we're actually working with a lot of different sort of stakeholders. And again, I'll give you a little example of that, I suppose. But this is sort of an outline of kind of how that developed. Like I said that this was outlined initially by Van Daren and Van Oors, the initial sort of theorists. Not really. They kind of had a rough idea, but this is sort of where we've kind of got to. We think these are the 6 critical steps. Of course, it doesn't always unfold that way. And again, I'll give an example. But this is as good a framework as any. And this is how it's kind of developed over that longer than I thought period of time. Yeah, I'll keep moving. I hope everyone is hearing me okay. It's always hard to tell when you're just talking to a screen. So that I mentioned, kind of incorporating these values and what has been tested or gathered in that data into a broader framework. So this is the Ballarat strategy to kind of guide the way in which the city develops over the next 20 years. Yeah, so I'm not sure how these kind of documents kind of are put together and what they look like in the Asian context that you're experiencing, but this is actually quite sort of different from an Australian context, that we're kind of starting with a set of principles and where we want our kind of local community to get to. There's a lot of things in here that could apply anywhere, but it's how do we sort of understand the uniqueness within those. But this has given a real sense of authority or like permission, confidence of people within the local planning systems to be thinking quite differently. That's me running some of the consultation sessions, whenever that was. But really it's about, so this kind of Ballarat Imagine, that kind of idea of the what do you love, what do you imagine, what do you want to keep, sort of then this is sort of that next phase. All right, so we've done that. Now we're kind of building that into very localized sort of detailed plans. And this is one of the examples I wanted to talk to you about. But you can see that's me sort of concentrating hard, looking at a map of Ballarat and working with local citizens and local people to map and understand things that are important within the broader context that have already been set. So it's like, okay, we've said generally that heritage is important. What do we actually mean by that? And yeah, trying to think of new and different ways of doing that engagement and being given the support to do that. And so that, I guess when you're talking about those partnerships, like there was one of the steps is kind of form the partnerships. Then that's, I'm not from the city, but I'm from the university, but I'm sort of involved and able to be part of that. There's actually other local businesses who are sort of contributing. So it's about making this sort of planning process owned and delivered more broadly across the city rather than just from the statutory or the sort of the prescribed authority to do that. And that's where, for example, I can talk to you today with a great deal of confidence that, like I've said, I'm not representing the city's view, but, you know, I've been able to come along. And so a lot of that is the partnership that's sort of been developed and the ways of doing that. And, yeah. And this is just really, you know, another version of those kind of steps. We're in a bit more detail. So it goes from Ballarat Imagine to the local area planning, and then this is kind of what we come up with. So with the sort of this is a mapping. So this is kind of an overlay that's been put over where conventionally you would have properties or individual buildings listed and protected, certain characteristics of which, because they're assessed as being of being historic value because of maybe their architecture or, you know, when they were built or something, and then they can't be demolished or changed significantly. That still exists, but what we're kind of overlaying on this is sort of what's the local character here. And so this is just a small part of Ballarat called Ballarat East, and you can see these kind of different. So we've got the character Forest Edge, and this is a place called Wawukarung, which is a sort of a regional park. But the central neighbourhood, urban heritage, and the civic heart. You know, I think we probably could have gone a bit further in there. Like we sort of came up with some other, you know, more sort of descriptive characteristics, but, you know, we wanted to start sort of in a way that was kind of understood. But I thought we could have pushed further. I think we had something like, you know, we're sort of talking about sort of values of like aspiration or values of connection, you know, to the urban city, and kind of understanding what the different. But this has been good progress, that we're not just looking at properties, we're looking at sort of characteristics more broadly, and it's kind of based on, you know, this kind of work that we've been doing, and research, you know, like the research I've been doing at the university. The big challenge in this place, Ballarat East, again, not particularly unique to this area, but the loss of green space. We could talk for a long time about this, but essentially there was a sense that this unique and distinctive neighbourhood that had been formed through the different land use patterns during the gold rush and social traditions of the gold rush, and, you know, the sort of labour working class kind of characteristics were being just overtaken by these kind of homogenized same kind of developments. And so this is where it kind of comes back into how it's sort of implemented, or this is how it comes across at the government level. Again, not to go through this, but it now becomes, so the things that were sort of described here: strengthen the garden setting, the tree canopy of the neighbourhood, maintaining and enhancing views, ensuring the development is sensitive to natural characteristics, slope terrain, services, encourage subdivision and development that incorporates best practice, to ensure that subdivision and development respects and complements the character of the area. This is now all written in to the planning scheme, and based on a lot of that participatory work that's done before. So yeah, these are the sort of regulatory tools. So you'll see in the toolkit that I can send you or show you the link to in a moment. But these are kind of some of the regulatory tools, but they're based on that initial engagement and ongoing engagement. And you can see here some examples of sort of public artworks that reinforce some of the original stories and the things that are valued. And yeah, this. Oh yeah, and here's the example. This is kind of a public artwork that's commissioned by the local government, but that is about sort of this sort of referencing the gold rush history in a modern way. And there's sort of augmented reality sort of tours along there. But it's, yeah. And yeah, and similarly here. So it's, I guess I'm just kind of showing these are some of the examples of the way that it's kind of coming out in the planning scheme, so that future developments can occur in certain ways in the public historical and public display through here. And this is like a, yeah, more like a land use or sort of connections, and yeah, different kinds of tools and outputs being produced. So this one came from the city of Ballarat, and this is what they kind of say about it. It holds this intrinsic part of our way of working because it has sort of been part of the tools that have started to be used. It's been embedded in planning, it informs the strategy, and so on. Most importantly, I believe, this is now me talking down the bottom here, that HUL's become most effective when it's not being deliberately implemented. So what has been a real challenge with HUL is, I think, is we're claiming to do something quite radical and different, but it's actually, there's a lot of just common sense to it. There's a lot of just, I wonder if I'm showing you all this stuff, and if any of you are thinking this is completely new or different. Again, I don't know the Asian context, but I know in Australia we were getting a lot of people saying, like, isn't this just what we should normally do? And I think it's kind of it's been more effective in kind of changing the organisational culture of a place like Ballarat, on the city of Ballarat in particular. It becomes part of the way in which bureaucrats are working. And yes, there are some regulatory sort of levers that you have, but actually it's over a period of 10 years that it has now become second nature, or natural, almost seemingly, for people to be thinking in historic urban landscape aligned ways. And I think that's the real shift. I'll just pause for a moment in case anyone's got anything to say, but I'm going to go on to another example and then maybe we'll have time to talk. Okay, so this is a real life example, and this is not all the stuff I've said before. That was HUL. That was the city saying, we are doing HUL, and this is how HUL looks. And I've explained a bit of it, but there's also a lot of links that I've got at the end of this presentation where you can look at the tools and look at the ways in which that has happened. This example, I believe, is an example of where it just started to happen. And yeah, so the Ballarat Orphanage. It's something I know quite a bit about in that I've written a history of this organisation from 1866 to 1983. So this is kind of how I've become most involved in sort of hull implementation or local implementation. So I'll give you just a quick background to the orphanage itself, because I'm sure you've not come across it before, but it was established in 1866. So if you remember back to that little timeline that it was before, sort of when the gold rush is really up and running, and there's a lot of the community is being formed at this point from scratch in the vision of a British colonial viewpoint. And it was established as the Ballarat District Orphan Asylum. And that's a picture of it there on the left. An artist's depiction. It's kind of wasn't as neat as this. But you can get the sense of the scale. It was a large monumental building intended to display to the world that Ballarat was a significant place. And like all of those other examples I showed you before of that Victorian architecture, it's almost like the architecture is the expression of the need to project security, the need, but also in this case, the need to project authority over children. This building stayed for 100 years until 1965. This photo is taken in 1965, and that's as this building was being dismantled. Because at that time, it wasn't considered an effective way of looking after children. Over this period, that 100 years, and then the subsequent. Okay, so then this building was replaced by a number of smaller, what they called cottages. And so at any one time, there would be 200 children living in the earlier period, living in this place, 200 to 300. And then it was, after they demolished it, they built a whole lot of smaller buildings, but the same number of kids, 200 to 300 children would be living, but just in smaller places, because it was considered a more effective practice in the 1960s, rather than having this here. So that's it. That's it just before it was taken down. And at this place called 200 Victoria Street, Ballarat East. It's just a little bit out of town. So it's quite a prominent sort of part of the city as you're driving into it from Melbourne. But that's it. But you can see, I said before, it wasn't so neat. I was in the early years, but look at this. Look at this, how neat and tidy this display of order that was happening within this institution. Like I said, with up to 300 children at a time. Generally, children would be sent there because by the state, by the government, who would remove children from, in many cases, remove children from their families because they weren't considered able to look after their families. That was sort of a characteristic of Australian social welfare systems at that time, and particularly with Aboriginal families. So there's a term that's become common in Australian society and history, which is the stolen generations. And it was actually from the time of colonisation, but especially in this period in the 1950s and 60s, where Aboriginal children were taken from their families and put into institutions like this for the express purpose of assimilating. It was called assimilation, which means making them more like white people. That's essentially what the policy was. So it's a very shameful part of Australian history, and you can see how the contrast between what's being presented in this kind of architecture and the way it's being kept, and what is actually happening, both within the families and within this institution. What we also know now, because there have been multiple investigations and reports, is that this institution and hundreds like it were the scene of the perpetration of sexual abuse and harm and other forms of abuse as well in a systematic manner. So this place, as beautiful as it looks, was actually a very dangerous place to be a child, and there were 300 children there at a time, right in the middle of the city. So you can see how it occupies this sort of ambivalent sort of position within Ballarat society, and it was not acknowledged at this time. In the 1960s and even until very recently, it was not acknowledged that these things happened. And again, that's a whole other discussion, but you can see, I guess, what I'm getting at in terms of that relationship between unfinished business and colonisation, and the ways in which heritage can uphold some of those unfavourable conditions of colonisation. And so this is, all right, so that's the 1960s. No. Okay, so, sorry, I thought I had a picture of it more, of the smaller buildings, but I don't. All right, so what happened in the so I'm trying to figure out how much detail to go into here. I won't go into much detail, but 1983 closes down because orphanages were not considered the right way to be looking after children. So the institution closed down in 1983. It became a high school on this site, a Catholic high school for about 20 years or so, and then it was bought by developers. So in around the mid-2000s, 2010, it was bought by property developers, and the intention was to turn it into, so this beautiful old building is no longer there. It's now a series of smaller buildings that had been built in the 1960s, 70s, and then adapted in the 1980s and 1990s. So when the developers came in and bought it, they just expected to be able to knock the whole thing down and build houses and sell them for a fortune. That was in about 2010. And what happened was former residents, because there was no heritage protection over those buildings, over the buildings that were built in the 1960s, because I was describing before, the way in which we understand heritage was about identifying value, historical value, and then protecting particular properties. And because historical value was defined in terms of how long ago something was built, or if someone famous built it, or if it was a unique example of something, because it was none of those things, because it was built in the 60s, so it was deemed of not significance, and so they were going to knock it down. The idea was to knock the whole thing down and make residential properties. Now, the people who grew up in the orphanage, this is Deb, one of them here in this newspaper article, were appalled by that idea, that it was assessed that there was no historical value to this place. Yet it was the home to 4,500 plus children over that 120 odd year period. And as it says here, a symbol of home, history and horror. It was also this horrific scene. So it's a really difficult one to know what to do with, because many people who grew up there and experienced that abuse, many of them don't ever want to know anything about it again, whereas others, it was the site of their childhood and they want it to be remembered. So it is quite a dilemma. So what they took it to the state level, like the next level up, to argue that it does have historical significance. And what they said was, yes, it does have historical significance, but only small parts of it. So this is the site now with the development overlay. And these are sort of the things that have been, these are the numbers are the sort of interpretation sites that we're going to do. But this building, this building and this wall have been retained. And they were specified to be retained by the state level, the Victorian level of heritage significance, because it was a toddler's block. It was known as the toddler's block because small children lived there. It was the only example of that was surviving. This schoolhouse was built in 1919 and it was considered to be a rare example of this kind of schoolhouse, and that it was still there. And this wall, I'll get onto that in a moment, but everything else, so all of this was the children's home, like those small, all demolished. So they're all gone now because they were not protected by heritage. That might be a good thing, might not, but that's how it happened. The wall, though, just as an example, just kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about, I suppose. Why are some materials kept and remembered? Why was that wall kept and not the other parts? The reason it was kept, this is in 2012, this decision was made. This is a unique example of the Yorkshire bonded bricking technique. So it's an architectural, that was its historical value as it was assessed. But the Yorkshire, place in England, and so it's about the technique, and it's about the form and the material, and that's why it was kept. That's that wall, right? This is in the 1970s. Here are children sort of playing against that wall. You can sort of see that's those oak trees just there. And it was a place, when I spoke with former residents, it was sort of what they talked about. They were so happy that the wall was going to be retained. But not because it was a Yorkshire bonded bricking technique, but it's because it's where they dreamed of a life beyond the walls. These are the Golding brothers. So it's Frank Golding, Bob Golding, and Bill Golding. They entered the orphanage in the 1940s. During the Second World War. And Frank tells us, that's Frank, and he tells the story of sitting on top of this fence, this wall, looking out over the other side, waiting for his father to come and pick him up at the end of the war, when the war finished. And he never did. And that site of, it's not a site of architectural significance, but it's a site of social and historic significance to this particular group. And so to kind of think about this, the resonance in a site like that, to think about what Graham David said, it's not about it's not about analytical precision, but resonance, and what meaning that kind of creates within new communities. This is going to be a new community. And so that's the challenge, how much do you kind of confront these difficult histories, and how much do you sort of incorporate them in what's being done? So that's Frank's story, and Bill and Bob. This is the picture I was looking for before. This is what it looked like in the 2010s. So when that decision was made to protect, so these are the two buildings that were protected, and then just on the other side of here is where that wall is. Oh, sorry, I should mention that's them standing in front of the wall, by the way, as adults. So that's the schoolhouse, that's that toddler's block in there. So for many years, these questions about values, they weren't solved, and actually there's just been it's just stopped. The former residents were angry that their perspectives weren't being valued, that they were sort of treated as what they want. They didn't get what they want, for one thing, but they felt like they were being disrespected. The developers were cautious. So, they're putting a lot of money into this, and they're suddenly saying, gee, I'm not sure about this investment now because we keep getting all of this resistance. And so some of the developers were starting to pull out. And it was really, it was a confrontation between former residents, the city of Ballarat, the authorities who had to make these decisions, and the developers. And the site was just left to ruin. There's all numbers there. So you can see here that these buildings have been taken over by vandals and almost being left to rot. Some years later, right? So that's about 2012. This is 2019. And like I said, we've got this kind of situation of paralysis here. This is a group of former residents. This picture is a group of former residents and council, like City of Ballarat, you know, sort of the planning authorities. And this is the site. That's the toddler's block. That's the trees that you would have seen in the background before. It's part of another fence that's kind of been kept. And this is them sort of negotiating and trying to work out how to best acknowledge the histories, these difficult histories of them and their sort of people that they grew up with here in this site. And here's a whole range of other pictures that have kind of come since then. So that's Frank, who you saw before in front of the wall with his brothers, who was talking about what that wall meant. That's Deb, who was in the newspaper article. That's Phyllis, who grew up in the orphanage in the 1960s, and that's Vicky, whose mother and auntie grew up in the orphanage as Aboriginal children. And them and others have kind of formed together in sort of like an advisory group that over, when did I say, 2019, over the last 2 years, we've been meeting constantly, again and again, to kind of keep that sort of dialogue going. So that's them on the site. That's the schoolhouse. That's John from the City of Ballarat, who is influential in a lot of these decisions. That's from the City of Ballarat. These are urban heritage designers from Sydney who have were selected by this group when the contract was put out to do what interpretation should happen on site. This group actually chose the designers, and they interviewed them, and they got the job. And they come down from Sydney, well, they used to before, when you're allowed to with COVID restrictions, but to come down and actually spend time there and to kind of keep talking again and again. This is a meeting in Melbourne because half of these guys live in Melbourne. So, you know, we have these sort of meetings again and again. This is Flossie, her name is Nora. Flossie and her sister Nora came, and that's Vicky, and that's her auntie. And they're Aboriginal people who grew up in the orphanage as part of that stolen generation. So there's a massive amount of pain and cultural disconnection with people who have lost connection to their culture through the practices of this orphanage. And here we are in with Wadawurrung elders or Wadawurrung community members undertaking a smoking ceremony before doing some of these consultations. And this is where this group of Aboriginal former residents, stolen generation, are looking through these photographs to kind of choose what's going to go into the interpretation, the historical interpretation on the site. And so they're there, and it was an extraordinary, amazing day of discovery. And so a lot of that sort of healing that is actually happening through this process of being asked about what's going to happen. And then this is her. That's Nora, and that's her sister, and that's her other sisters. And when we were looking through this photograph album, that was the first time that she had seen a photograph of the three sisters together, because they were all then separated after being in the orphanage. It was the only time they've ever all been together, and there was a photograph. And so how sort of important and powerful that is, that through this process, we're actually having this kind of, I think, sort of positive effect. Yeah. And so through that, instead of a planning scheme, or as well as a planning scheme, we came up with we've called an interpretation guide, and it's about, I can send it to you, it's publicly available. But this was sort of the feature of it, like that there was a previous interpretation guide done, and it was all about, you know, it was about essentially the Yorkshire bonded technique, or this is about the wall, or is about the school, or is about the built environment. And when we worked with those people who used to live there, this is what they came up with: relationships what is important about this place. This is what should be conveyed in the interpretations on site. Many of us lost our families and cultures. Many of us also made new families. We worked hard for nothing. We didn't know why we were here, when we would leave or where we would go. And every one of us lost something by coming here, but we have done all we can to recover. And so that's a completely different message from what was being put out before, which was one of, and it's one that kind of covers the sort of histories of abuse. But yeah, but without that becoming the point. And we've found that it's a much more kind of inclusive, engaging, and we're getting much better buy-in as a result. And it is now no longer a confrontation between the developers, because the developers get this. They understand that it's important. So it's no longer a confrontation between the developers, the former residents, community, and the council. It feels more like a negotiation. And this is the heritage interpretation guide that I've talked about before, and I'm happy to send that through. But yeah, so now it's kind of going through each site and saying these are the kind of things that we want to go in there that fit into these messages. And here are some materials. Here are some direct quotes from people who were there, a girl from the Ballarat Children's Home, and so on. And this is what it's not like we're in the middle of doing those designs just now, but this is now what the kind of designs that we're coming up with. So it's moved from a very sort of either keep it quiet, don't talk about it, then to a very serious kind of exploration of dark histories, to now this. Now that says never forgotten. And this is an arbor with, or an arch with roses growing out of it, and almost like a reclaiming. If you remember that earlier picture of the ordered roses, and that's them remembering, saying, we remember there were roses here, but we were never allowed in there, and they just felt so separate to us. We want that to be part of the future, so that there's this very sophisticated discussion. It's got space for, writing, photographs, interpretation. So that's just one part of it. An open reserve. This is where they're going to have their reunions from now on. Yeah. So there's much more to it than there's more, but I hope you can kind of see the way in which things have shifted. And just by way of saying, so why is it different? What's so different between 2010, when this kind of erupted as this sort of very confrontational heritage battle, to now, where it is quite different? What I think has changed, attention on the histories of orphanages and children's home has meant that those histories of abuse and those painful histories are no longer swept under the carpet, or what's the word? No longer ignored. So yeah, we can no longer ignore those histories of abuse and neglect. Whereas before we could probably just, we could let that go. But that's because the government has done multiple inquiries into sexual abuse and done multiple prosecutions, and the media is now and activists like those in our group have focused attention on these things. So you can't just not acknowledge it anymore. But demographic change. So we're no longer, if you think from the developer's point of view, they're no longer selling to people who want to maintain that comfortable and nostalgic view of Ballarat's past. They're actually selling to people who are coming from Melbourne or from anywhere in the world, really. And they don't have as much of a connection to this actually quite damaging historical trend, I believe, in Ballarat around nostalgia and comfortable versions of our past. So it means you can start to push this. So this demographic change is that Ballarat is no longer the primary market for Ballarat urban development. And this bureaucratic change, and I think this is the really, so all these things are happening anyway, but through Hull, we've got a culture of change in government, and a willingness to innovate and a willingness to question authorised versions of heritage, like we need to list this or we need to do that. you know, we need to protect this in favour of a values approach. We didn't follow a guidebook because we didn't have one. There wasn't one for Hull. We've kind of written it, but I actually believe that was valuable. It wasn't about following step by step and saying this is Hull. It was more about having the confidence to question the ways that things have always been done, and to have the authority of UNESCO, Ballarat, you know, and this broader movement typified by you all and the, you know, the work that we're doing to kind of change these notions of heritage gives us a lot of confidence to actually do that on the ground. And then what have we learnt? The three P's in English: politeness, patience, and persistence. There is no point trying to confront these, trying to make these into a battle. No, let me rephrase that. Sometimes things need to be a battle because you can't just expect things to change for no reason. But when we're talking about urban heritage and values that are deeply held in opposite ways, or at least contradictory ways, then we actually do need to be polite. We need to respect each other's perspectives. We need to be patient. This has been a 12-year process, this example of the Ballarat orphanage, but it's improved in the last 2 years. So, you know, we need to be patient. There are a lot of people say, why hasn't this been fixed? And it's because it has taken time, and we need to be comfortable with that. And persistence. So don't, you know, not giving up, not just saying, okay, well, everyone's opposed, so we're going to go a different way. Just need to be able to persist and have those kind of values that we're sort of striving for. This idea of empathy rather than authority. Empathy being, you know, the practice of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So putting yourself, looking at things from someone else's perspective. And yeah, but that needs to happen at all levels. And actually, the former residents in this example of the orphanage have had to think from the government's point of view, and they've had to think from the developer's point of view. It's not just everybody feeling empathy or sympathy with former residents and former orphans, but how that kind of goes in all sorts of directions. Making sure that engagement is required, not just seen as, you know, a nice thing to do. So that's where, yeah, so those residents, Frank and Phyllis and Deb and who I mentioned before, that is in the planning scheme. They must be consulted because they hold the social value. And so if we ever got sort of resistance from anywhere within the local authority, we were able to say, we have to do this. So what we are able to do is shift it away from just something that we do because we have to, but we do because we have to and because we want to do it well. And that Hull, the Historical Urban Landscape Approach, gave us the framework for that. And to be in tune with what's happening in your community and in the broader society. So what I'm talking about here, what's happening in government? What are the sort of demographic changes that are happening? What are the things that are valued more broadly that you can tap into and be part of, rather than fighting against necessarily, and rather than thinking that meaning and value is fixed. And I think this is the real challenge that Hull sort of presents to our ways of doing heritage, because heritage has, you know, by many definitions, is about, what is it? Enduring and universal value. Heritage is about representing and protecting areas of and monuments of enduring and universal value. Now that's very different to what Hull is saying. So there is a challenge that's going to come here, and there are different, I don't think they're completely incompatible worldviews, but I hope I've been able to show you a bit about how it has unfolded in Ballarat. A few challenges and so on here, but thank you.